You know, I play many types of games. Easy games, hard games, a little mix of both, all that. When it comes to hard games in particular, I don't play them nearly as often for a lifetime. A lot of games I thought were nearly impossible to beat back then turned out to actually be pretty leveled down in challenge when playing them now. That's more or less the case with Mega Man X anyway. So knowing this, I want to see just how well I can stomach the tension of hard games, which is the main reason I try my darndest to get a perfect score on every boss and every level in Cuphead. It wasn't as easy as Mega Man X, obviously, but I did accomplish it. So with that in mind, I feel pretty jacked up. Think I could take on just about anything. Sure, I haven't played some of the more recently proclaimed hard games, but 200%ing Cuphead is pretty high up there anyway. So, guess what game series I decided to challenge? Well, actually the video title already did that for you, so... Ah yes, the NES Ninja Gaiden Trilogy. Before the slew of modern hard games that we have now, this is the game series both famous and infamous for being one of the hardest of the earliest years of gaming. And mind you, this is the same time period where we get games like Castlevania, Battletoads, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Wait, knowing that this series definitely has a lot of reputation stacking up over the years. The game features Ryu Hayabusa, a ninja whose lineage is known for possessing the Dragon Sword, destined to fight all evil, seeking to tear the world apart with purple hues and unfairly spawned projectiles. Along the way, he comes across a bunch of characters. The token distress damsel Irene, Archaeology Santa, resident Grinch Foster, and Jacuyo, everyone's favorite nightmare fuel. Now, as someone who didn't exactly grow up with the series, I can't say I experienced the horror that it presented upon many people's childhoods. That said, I more or less understood the kind of pain this game can deliver, especially since I played the original Mega Man during childhood. So let's just say I know what it's like to be a dumb kid playing an unfairly built game. Anyways, that's it with the brief, so how about we get into the actual games themselves? Since I've played all 3 games in the series, I feel obliged to give my full thoughts on all of them. So let's kick things off with the first game. The original Ninja Gaiden is the one game in the series that everyone talks about. Apparently, being regarded as the easiest game of this banquet of nightmare also makes it the most accessible. That's not saying much though, since it's still quite a hefty challenge for the fingerbones. Playing it myself, I can certainly concede that it lives up to its reputation. The game certainly knows how to test your gaming skills and reflexes in its purest and tightest form. And that is why it's awesome! Ninja Gaiden is just the right amount of balance between difficult and enjoyable. It does lean a little bit more towards the difficult part, but the fact that it manages to still be a lot of fun to play is an accomplishment of its own. You play pretty much as you expect as a ninja. You dash, jump, climb walls, slice your enemies, use special weapons, all that sweet stuff. Every stage is designed with the utilization of the mechanics in mind, and the difficulty curve surrounding it is exceptionally steady. The game really does feel like it gets progressively harder in a sensible way. Every stage introduces a new kind of hazards you have to cope with, and these hazards grow more prevalent as you progress. For example, the first stage is an easy stroll through a level ground, whereas in the second stage, you get introduced to multiple subparts of one stage as well as a myriad of bottomless pits, ready to snatch your life instantly. It's during these moments when you gotta start paying attention to how you play, because even the smallest mistakes can penalize you with a level reset. And it gets even crazier. Future stages will start swarming you with new kinds of enemies to traverse against, ones that fly, shoot projectiles, move weird, and even spawn at the most meticulous spots you can imagine. The game knows exactly where and when to introduce a new kind of hazard, and how to teach players to prepare for what's to come for each stage. You gotta know the right timing to duck, climb the walls, and utilize a given special weapon to get past an obstacle without sustaining too much damage. Watching out for your ammunition is also pretty vital, especially if you're using a spinning sword attack, which, all things considered, makes surviving long through the game without dying pretty rewarding. Even if the game gets trial and error-ish, there's still a sense that you're learning to subvert your mistakes as practically as possible, which is exactly what draws the best aspect out of a hard game. And even on top of that, the atmosphere and overall feel of the game is amazing. Ninja Gaiden's art style was effective back then, and it's still effective today. The graphics, the designs of the enemies, and especially the backgrounds wonderfully tie together with the tone of the game being about a ninja fighting through an army of Cthulhu-loving villains. Being one of the first games to introduce video game cutscenes certainly puts the game on a pretty high mantle. Don't even get me started on how catchy the music is. Once again, you can't pick a better composition style to fit the game's overall nature. All these people know what they got themselves into, and boy did they put their heart and soul into it. So with all that hyper praise I'm showering, this must be an absolutely perfect game, right? No. Ninja Gaiden, despite its remarkable achievements, is not without a few of those good old NES game hiccups. For one, it's glitchy. And I mean really glitchy. There are multiple instances of the sword not hitting your target even when it connects, and sometimes drop items just phase through the floor. These glitches get so insane that some of them even became integrated strategies to get past enemy spawn points. But of course, I can't talk about glitches in Ninja Gaiden if I didn't bring up that. For context, every time you lose to a boss in this game, you often get sent back to the beginning of the nearest substage. When it comes to the final boss, the same applies only to the Japanese version, because apparently the localized version thought it would be funny to send you this far back and suffer through all of Stage 6's falcon-ridden hellhole again. See, here's the funny thing. I never grew up playing this game, yet I have heard tales of this particularly mean-spirited kick in the nuts moment the localization team added on purpose. Because of that, I came in playing this game knowing full well of this intentional setback and give it my all to fight back. It's the one single moment of the game where you need to turn on your masochistic light box in order to face the worst that this game will throw at you. It certainly doesn't help that the game overall lacks a password feature, meaning unless you emulate the game or play it on a virtual console, you're gonna have to go through the whole game in one sitting. The older times are far from generous with these things. As for the bosses, they're mostly pretty simple and straightforward. However, by the time you reach the finale, things start to get different. You have to form legitimate strategies if you want any hope of surviving the onslaught this finale has to throw at you. Notably being proficient at wall climbing against the masked devil, knowing the right technique to dodge Jakuyo's fireballs, and shimmy around below the Demon King. It's a tight gamble of lives when fighting all these final bosses, which is why it's always important to try and beat them on your first try, since only then will the game replenish your health after every form. But man oh man, nothing feels more satisfying than beating a game widely proclaimed for its menacing legacy. Ninja Gaiden, despite its flaws, still holds up today as a true classic among hard games. It knows how to be challenging without getting distracted from having a smooth gameplay pace and wonderful presentation, making the experience as fun and enjoyable as it needs to be. And you know what? The game is available on the Switch Virtual Console, so if you haven't played it, your chance could never be better. If you love hard games and are willing to stomach some punishing antics, I can say for sure that you'll have a good time with this one. Well, that's a fun one. So, if the first game is this good with all the gifts wrapped up for it, that means the sequel should be even better, right? Given how well developed the first game is, that's a hefty promise to live up to. And you know what? For most of the time, that is the case. The sequels really do try to push the gambit further with its designs and mechanics, so it's clear that the series really aims to take its prowess to the next level. So then, how much did it all pay off? The second game in the series maintains a good number of key features from the first game, particularly its visual and auditory wonder, the flexible ninja, and a nice little story to keep you interested. Barring those, it received quite a number of noteworthy updates from the first game. You can crawl over just about any wall now, and some of the power-ups have been replaced with the new ones. Say goodbye to the spinning sword and hello to the shadow clones, a power-up that pretty much gave this game its identity. Additionally, this game glamorizes stage hazards to an obsessive degree. Every stage in the game has one or two gimmicks pulling the strings of the game's flow. You can tell that overall, there's a lot of passion and effort put into making this game stand out far more than the first game ever did on the gameplay front. That being said though, I don't much care for this one. Boy, am I not making friends by saying that. Ninja Gaiden 2, despite all its efforts to progress from the first game, doesn't exactly do a good job at improving over it. If anything, I find that a lot of the key gameplay elements to just regress in favor of making the game harder. What do I mean by that? You know how I complained about the sword from the first game being kind of stiff? Well, the sword hitbox in this game is awful. Almost 50% of the time, slashing directly in front of an enemy somehow doesn't kill or damage them. It will be fine if this is just something that happens to a few enemies, but it's everywhere. I just want a power-up! It shouldn't be this difficult to get a power-up! How do you somehow fail to at least replicate the same weapon hitbox from the first game, and instead put out something worse that wound up damaging a huge chunk of the game's enjoyment? As hard as the first game is, at least being able to find ways to properly execute your sword attacks can maintain a consistent and reliable pace. Here though, it's just luck. If you can't hit an enemy with a sword, then you best hope you still have ammunition to spare for a special weapon. It's almost hilarious that the one game talking about how special Ryu's sword is also the same one where it's literally the worst part of the whole game. Now, a lot of people say that the Shadow Clones subvert most of the difficulties surrounding the game. And yeah, it's kind of true. The Shadow Clones not only follow your every movement, but also attacks using both swords and special weapons, meaning you can cover a pretty big range of attack. A lot of bosses and enemy ambushes became much easier to traverse because of these. As long as you have the Shadow Clones tagging along with you, there's few to worry about. But that's pretty much where the bad beef of the game comes in. It's very unbalanced. You either rely on the Shadow Clones to ride you to the end of the game, or fight by yourself with a buggy main weapon and a sloppier platforming hitbox on your side. Oh, and speaking of platforming, let's talk about those stage hazards, shall we? The stage hazards in Gaiden 2 exist mainly to add an extra layer of challenge to the game. Now, when handled well, it could really work. Stage 4's lava hazards and water currents actually flows pretty well with the rest of the level. But then you got levels that pretty much forces you to stall. Stage 2 has you wait around for the wind current to change, or you'll get haphazardly interrupted during a sequence of enemy takedowns. And Stage 3 blacks out the platform to the point where you have to pray you can find a safe ground to jump on before all the flying embers catch up to you. And the less I bring up Stage 5, the better. Again, in the first game, you have a decent amount of obstacles and coherent level designs to handle on your plate, which keeps the pacing just right. This game has way too many wide gaps, physics-altering hazards, and badly placed enemy spawns. It's like someone's Mario Maker level version of Ninja Gaiden, if that could even be a thing back then. Oh yeah, and still no password feature. Yeah, real golden. Granted, it doesn't send you far back for losing to the final boss, so at least it has that going for it. But holy good hell in a handbasket, I swear! Stage 7-2 is worse than the entirety of Stage 6 in the first game. It embodies every bit of the platforming trip-outs I mentioned, and it's beyond unpleasant. The final boss is similar to some of the other bosses in the game, where you can pretty much cheese a lot of risky shots by having your shadow clone take care of the damage dealing for you. The same applies for the second phase, and the third phase is pretty much just an easier version of the final game's final form. Not much else to add there. Even after beating the last set of bosses, the conclusion feels bittersweet at best. Add a sprinkle of Ryu being a jerk, and you got the perfect aftertaste to close the whole game with. Good grief, that was absolute torture. It's honestly a shame though. The developers clearly put a lot of effort with this game, and yet it regresses on the most basic mechanics that the first game was able to get right just fine. It's still a good game to an extent, but it's hardly a surprise that it didn't get talked about as much as its predecessor. Ah well, hopefully with the third game, they finally got all these coagulated inconveniences polished accordingly. The third and final game in the NES trilogy has set itself for quite a record. Often regarded as one of the absolute hardest games in the library, this is definitely not a game for everyone. And I do mean that, it straight up refused to be released in some countries it was so hard. But what about its renovations? Well, if you ask me, it renovates exactly how it should. The platforming is no longer stiff, there's a new sword power-up to help negate any problems the weapon hitbox used to have, and the enemies are built so that it's easy to hit them to the flow of the stage designs. Even the stage hazards are much more tuned into the pacing of the game. Well, most of them anyway. So, with all that said, this must mean that Ninja Gaiden 3 is just the right sequel to succeed over the masterpiece that is the first game, right? Close. Remember that it's still one of the hardest NES games ever made. Despite how much more fair it's being with the established mechanics, Ninja Gaiden 3 is still a game that tries anything and everything in its power to be bone-bustingly agonizing. Every enemy deals 2 to 3 points of damage, and some hazards can deal up to 5 points. Substages go on for many segments, and dying even once sends you back to the first segment of the substage. Getting a game over sends you back to the start of the whole stage, and with limited continues, you're bound to lose all your progress from dying too much. There are many instances where you have to keep an eye out on your health and make absolutely sure you don't miss out on an extra life. Yeah, they actually matter here. It really does feel like a pure skill game, pushing you to adapt and understand all the hazards as quickly as possible. The penalties are so harsh that if you lack the patience to keep trying and trying on the farthest checkpoint, you're bound to rage quit. Just like I did the second and third time playing. I did manage to clutch the finale though. On its own, the final bosses are the easiest in the trilogy, given how predictable most of his attack patterns are. But the real crisis is trying to survive the fight without dying once. Trust me, stage 7 of this game is not one you want to reset through far too often. It is by and large the hardest set of stages in the entire series, and the most guilty criminal of nightmare-inducing rage quits even compared to Gaiden 1's final stage. I don't want to say I don't like this game because, objectively, it's a very well built and polished game, even if it does try my patience to its blood-curdling limit. I think what I found most interesting about it overall is the process going behind the game's development. Masato Kato, who took over Hideo Yoshizawa's role as the main developer from the Japanese development team, wanted to take a different direction with this game and make it a much more accessible installment for all players to enjoy. So really, this game was originally meant to be the easiest game in the whole series. But as it turns out, the localization team already have their favorite robot master.
I'm tough stuff!
And so this is what everyone else gets. With that in mind, I decided to check out the Japanese version of Ninja Gaiden 3 and see just how different it is from the localized one. And wow, they weren't kidding. It really is the easiest Ninja Gaiden. The first half particularly is pretty generous with all the above average handicaps you get. Between the lesser enemy quantity and the penalty being as casual as the previous games, it's honestly the least tense part of the whole series. The second half did eventually pick up on the standard ninja nut-kicking shenanigans, but even then the final levels are far less punishing than what the previous games had on their record. I'm happy to see it has a password system, but given the lesser difficulty, This feels like the version that needs it the least out of all of them. I think if we can get a good mixed balance between this and the localized version, somewhere there's a really sturdy installment that can truly achieve the series' absolute highest standard. Personally, I did have more fun playing the Japanese version, if only just because it's a gigantic stress relief from what the series typically offers. And hey, even if I don't understand the cutscenes, it's totally fine since the story of this game is kind of a mess anyway. I mean, we went from demon cults to aliens and doppelgangers, just mishmashed together without any coherent relative. Yeah, things just kinda happen in this one. Hell, while I'm at it, I can just ad-lib my own dialogue.
Irene, you're alive!
Take cover, boy! I'ma put bullets in this faker's ribs!
You can't hurt me. You can't do anything. Must really suck being a useless gaming damsel in the early 90s, huh? You know, if you never transformed, you could have kicked my duff with your advanced ninja skills like you did earlier. But now that you did, you're just a big, slogging target for me to wail on.
Then again, I'd have killed you if you don't transform, so it's a lose-lose situation for you either way.
Well, crap. Foster, can you help me? Shit.
So that's the Ninja Gaiden Trilogy. Overall, it's what you can expect from a series of hard games in the NES generation. Whether or not it's the best of what NES could offer is not something I can personally judge. What I can say for sure, however, is that it's definitely one of the NES's most ambitious series of titles. Ninja Gaiden seeks to push the boundaries of how complex and challenging an NES platformer can get. Yeah, it's guilty for numerous cases of thrown controllers and broken thumbs, but it knows how to make it a pleasure in doing so. Do I recommend these games? Well, if we're talking the first game,
of course!
The sequels aren't as easy for me to recommend. I'd say give them a shot if you want to test just how high your tolerance for hard games can go. In that case, then good luck to you and pray that you have the mental endurance to carry through. So, with this much ground on the NES trilogy covered, you might be wondering what I think of the SNES trilogy collection. It's ugly, expensive, does nothing to revamp the games, and didn't even try to fix the glaring technical problems. All it has going for it is a password system, but really you're better off using save states on the NES games. Just dodge this one like a falcon ambush. Do better than that.